On the morning of the school talent show, Amara felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. She had been looking forward to performing for weeks, but her usual enthusiasm was overshadowed by a nervous tension that her parents couldn't quite understand. When Amara took the stage, her parents watched with growing unease as the performance turned into something shocking and inappropriate. Instead of the joyful showcase they had envisioned, they witnessed their daughter humiliated in front of the entire audience. As the truth began to surface, it forced the community to confront the painful reality of how they had failed Amara. This moment would leave lasting scars on her and her family, forever altering their lives. Before we dive into this emotional story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you're ready to join Amara on this powerful journey, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The afternoon sun streamed through the kitchen windows as 11-year-old Amara burst through the front door, her backpack bouncing wildly against her back. Her mother, Amina, looked up from her laptop where she had been reviewing patient files, startled by her daughter's unusual entrance. Mom, you won't believe what's happening at school." Amara's eyes sparkled with excitement as she dropped her backpack on the kitchen floor. Her dark curls were escaping from her carefully braided hairstyle, giving her an even more animated appearance. "Slow down, sweetheart," Amina laughed, closing her laptop. "What's got you so excited?" "We're having a talent show." Amara twirled around the kitchen island, her uniform skirt swishing. "And Mrs. Dawson picked me to be in it. She says I have something special, Mom. Something unique." Just then, David, Amara's father, walked in from his home office, drawn by the commotion. "Did I hear something about a talent show?" he asked, his warm smile matching his daughter's enthusiasm. "Dad!" Amara rushed to give him a tight hug. "You and Mom have to come. It's going to be the best show ever. Mrs. Dawson says it's going to be different from anything anyone's ever seen before." David exchanged an amused glance with his wife. "Well, that sounds intriguing. What are you going to do in the show, Princess?" Amara's excited bouncing slowed for just a moment. Mrs. Dawson says it's kind of a surprise. She's planning everything. The costume, the music, everything. She says she's going to take care of all the details, so we don't have to worry about anything." Amina raised an eyebrow. "That's generous of her. But shouldn't you at least practice at home?" No. Amara shook her head vigorously. "Mrs. Dawson says we need to keep it special. We're having rehearsals at school during lunch break. She says it's going to be perfect." David sat down at the kitchen island. "Well, as long as you're having fun with it." "When is the show?" "In 2 weeks." Amara grabbed an apple from the fruit bowl. "Mrs. Dawson says we need to practice a lot until then. She says it's going to show everyone how special our school is because we celebrate everyone's different backgrounds." "That sounds wonderful," Amina said, though something in her daughter's tone made her pause. "You know you can tell us if you need help with anything, right?" "Of course, Mom." "But Mrs. Dawson says she's got it all figured out." Amara bit into her apple. She's been teaching for 20 years. She knows exactly what she's doing. As the days passed, the initial excitement in the Thompson household began to shift. A week into rehearsals, Amina noticed Amara wasn't bouncing through the door anymore. Instead, she walked in quietly, often heading straight to her room to do homework. One evening, as Amara picked at her dinner, David tried to spark conversation. "How was rehearsal today, sweetheart?" Amara shrugged, pushing her green beans around her plate. "Fine." Amina exchanged a concerned look with her husband. "Just fine? Last week you couldn't stop talking about how exciting it was going to be." "It's still exciting," Amara mumbled, not meeting their eyes. "Mrs. Dawson says everything's going according to plan. Would you like to show us what you've learned so far?" David suggested gently. "We could give you feedback, Dad." "No." Amara's fork clattered against her plate. Mrs. Dawson says we can't show anyone. It has to be a surprise. She says that's what will make it special." The next few days brought more changes. Amara, usually chatty about her school day, became increasingly withdrawn. When asked about the talent show, she would simply say, "Mrs. Dawson is handling everything," before changing the subject or finding a reason to leave the room. One night, after Amara had gone to bed, Amina and David sat in their living room, sharing their concerns. "I don't like this, David," Amina said, curled up on the couch with a cup of tea. Something's not right. Have you noticed how she barely smiles anymore when we mention the show? David sighed, running a hand through his hair. Maybe it's just nerves? You remember how anxious you used to get before your piano recitals. This feels different, Amina insisted. It's like the joy has been sucked out of her. The Amara who came home that first day was bursting with excitement. Now she can barely look at us when we talk about it. Should we talk to Mrs. Dawson? David suggested. Amina shook her head slowly. I don't know. Amara seems so insistent that we trust Mrs. Dawson's judgment. I don't want to make things worse by interfering. Maybe we should just keep an eye on things for now. You're right, David agreed, though his face showed his uncertainty. Let's give it a few more days. If things don't improve, we can talk to the school. That night, as they lay in bed, both parents found sleep elusive. The sound of Amara tossing and turning in her room next door echoed their own restlessness. Something was changing in their daughter, something that went beyond normal performance anxiety. The following morning, Amara barely touched her breakfast. When Amina tried to pack her favorite lunch, she just shook her head. I have to practice during lunch, she said quietly. Mrs. Dawson says we need extra rehearsal time. But you need to eat, sweetie, Amina protested. I'm not hungry anyway, Amara replied, shouldering her backpack. Mrs. Dawson says the performance has to be perfect. She says it's really important for the school. As they watched their daughter walk to the bus stop, her shoulders slightly hunched, Amina turned to David. I know we said we'd wait, but... David wrapped an arm around his wife's shoulders. I know. Something's definitely wrong. But what can we do? Every time we try to talk about it, she just keeps saying Mrs. Dawson is handling everything. Maybe that's the problem, Amina said softly. Maybe Mrs. Dawson is handling too much. The rest of the week continued in the same vein. Amara grew quieter and more withdrawn. Her usual weekend activities, drawing, playing with her collection of science experiments, even watching her favorite TV shows, held no interest. Instead, she spent long hours in her room, door closed, silence her only companion. When Sunday evening arrived, Amina knocked on Amara's door with a plate of cookies, hoping to spark some conversation. She found her daughter sitting cross-legged on her bed, staring at nothing in particular. Sweetheart, Amina sat down beside her. You know you can tell us if something's bothering you, right? About anything, not just the talent show. For a moment, something flickered in Amara's eyes, fear, uncertainty, but then it was gone, replaced by that now familiar blank expression. Everything's fine, Mom, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Dawson says we just need to trust her. She says it's going to be really special. Amina set the cookies down and pulled her daughter into a gentle hug. Amara stiffened for a moment before relaxing into her mother's embrace, but she remained silent. Later that night, Amina and David stood in the hallway outside their daughter's room, listening to the sound of her restless movement. I don't care what Mrs. Dawson says, Amina whispered fiercely. This isn't right. Our daughter is suffering. David nodded, his face etched with worry. But how do we help her if she won't tell us what's wrong? Every time we try to talk about it, she just hides behind Mrs. Dawson, Amina finished. I know, but there's something going on here, David. Something more than just stage fright or performance anxiety. Should we pull her out of the show? David suggested. Amina shook her head slowly. I'm afraid that might make things worse. Whatever's happening, she seems scared to disappoint Mrs. Dawson. We need to figure out why. They agreed to keep watching, to stay alert for any sign that might help them understand what was happening to their usually vibrant daughter. But as they headed to their own room, both felt the weight of helplessness settling on their shoulders. The talent show was less than a week away, and their daughter, their bright, confident, joy-filled Amara, seemed to be disappearing before their eyes, replaced by a quiet, anxious shadow of herself. All their attempts to reach her were met with the same response. Mrs. Dawson is handling everything. But as they would soon discover, what Mrs. Dawson was handling would shake their family to its core and force them to confront uncomfortable truths about their daughter's school and the people they had trusted to educate her. For now, though, they could only watch and worry as their daughter struggled with a burden she felt she couldn't share, trapped between her trust in her teacher and a growing sense that something was very, very wrong. The morning of the talent show dawned gray and overcast, matching the heavy atmosphere in the Thompson household. Amara sat at the kitchen table, barely touching the breakfast Amina had prepared, her favorite chocolate chip pancakes that usually disappeared within minutes. "Sweetheart, you need to eat something," Amina urged, watching her daughter push the food around her plate. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence, marking each moment of tension. Amara's hands trembled slightly as she lifted her fork, then set it down again. The dark circles under her eyes testified to another sleepless night. Her normally neat braids were slightly askew, as if she'd been tossing and turning. "I'm not hungry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The cheerful yellow walls of their kitchen seemed to mock the gloom surrounding her. David entered, adjusting his tie. He'd taken the morning off work to help get Amara ready for the show. "How's my star performer this morning?" he asked, trying to inject some enthusiasm into the heavy atmosphere. Amara's response was to push her plate away and stand up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I need to get ready," she mumbled, heading toward the stairs. "Wait, honey," Amina called after her. "Don't you need your costume? Should we stop by the store, Dad?" "No." Amara's voice cracked. "Mrs. Dawson has everything at school," she said. "She said we can't see the costumes until right before the show. It's part of the surprise." David and Amina exchanged worried glances as their daughter disappeared upstairs. The sound of the bathroom door closing echoed through the house. "It's just nerves," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Remember her first piano recital? She was nervous then, too." Amina shook her head, gathering the untouched breakfast plates. "This is different, David. That was normal stage fright. This is something else." Upstairs, they could hear Amara moving around, the floorboards creaking under her feet. Every few minutes, they heard her pause, followed by a deep, shaky breath. When she finally came down, dressed in her school uniform, Mrs. Dawson's instructions, she'd said, her hands were visibly shaking. As Amina helped her with her coat, she noticed her daughter's fingers were ice cold despite the warm spring morning. The drive to school was silent. Amara sat in the back seat, staring out the window, her reflection in the glass, showing eyes wide with what looked increasingly like fear. Every few minutes, her hands would clench and unclench in her lap. The school parking lot was already full when they arrived. Parents and siblings streamed toward the auditorium, many carrying flowers and balloons. The festive atmosphere felt jarringly at odds with their daughter's demeanor. "Do you want us to come backstage with you?" Amina asked as they approached the building. Amara shook her head violently. "Mrs. Dawson said parents aren't allowed backstage. She says it'll ruin the surprise." Before either parent could respond, Mrs. Dawson herself appeared at the side entrance, her tall figure commanding attention in a bright floral dress. "Amara, there you are. We need to get you ready." Her voice was overly cheerful, almost artificial. Amara gave her parents a quick, mechanical hug and hurried after her teacher, disappearing through the stage door. David squeezed Amina's hand as they watched their daughter vanish into the darkness of the backstage area. They found seats near the front, as instructed in the program. The auditorium filled quickly, the buzz of excited conversation growing louder. On stage, the heavy red curtain remained closed, hiding whatever preparations were happening behind it. The program began with the principal's welcome speech, full of platitudes about diversity and celebration of cultures. Then the performances began. The first few acts were standard talent show fare: a piano piece, a gymnastics routine, a group singing performance. But as the show progressed, both Amina and David began to notice something unsettling. A Filipino student performed what was billed as a traditional dance, but seemed more like a caricature of Asian movement. A Hispanic boy was dressed in an outfit that looked like it came from a Halloween costume shop's Mexican section, complete with an oversized sombrero. "David," Amina whispered, gripping her husband's arm. "Are you seeing this?" He nodded, his jaw tightening. "Maybe we're reading too much into it," he said, but his voice was uncertain. During a brief intermission, they caught a glimpse of Amara backstage through a gap in the curtain. She was pacing back and forth, biting her nails, something she hadn't done since she was 6. Her face was pale, and even from a distance, They could see she was trembling. David raised his hand in an encouraging wave, trying to catch her eye. Amara saw them and quickly turned away, disappearing deeper backstage. The glimpse they caught of her expression made their hearts sink. It was the look of someone walking to their execution. "Something's wrong," David whispered to Amina. "This isn't just stage fright anymore. Should we go back there? Pull her out of the show." Amina's voice was tight with worry. Before they could decide, the lights dimmed again. The principal returned to the microphone, her smile bright and oblivious. "And now, we have a very special performance. Amara Thompson will be presenting a celebration of African cultural heritage." The curtain rose, and time seemed to stop. Amara stood center stage, but she was almost unrecognizable. She wore a costume that made both her parents' blood run cold. A garish, stereotypical mishmash of African elements that looked like they'd been pulled from a century-old minstrel show. Her face was painted with exaggerated markings that bore no resemblance to any actual African tribal designs. The costume was completed with a grass skirt made of what looked like party decorations and plastic beads that clinked together discordantly. The music that began to play was a jumble of drum beats and generic tribal sounds, bearing no resemblance to any actual African music. And then, worst of all, Amara began to move. The choreography was a series of exaggerated, stereotypical movements that seemed designed to mock rather than honor African dance traditions. Amara's face was a mask of discomfort and shame as she performed the movements Mrs. Dawson had taught her, each gesture more offensive than the last. Amina's hand flew to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. David sat rigid in his seat, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles turned white. Around them, the audience watched with polite interest, seemingly oblivious to the horror unfolding on stage. "Oh my God," Amina whispered, her voice breaking. "Oh my God, what have they done to our baby?" On stage, Amara continued the performance, her movements mechanical and forced. Her eyes were fixed on a point far above the audience, refusing to look at anyone. The plastic beads rattled with each movement, a discordant accompaniment to the inappropriate music. The audience's reaction made it even worse. They smiled and nodded, some even swaying to the music, completely unaware or uncaring about the deeply offensive nature of what they were watching. A few people were filming with their phones, and the thought of this humiliation being preserved digitally made David feel physically ill. They watched in horrified silence as their daughter, their bright, confident Amara, was forced to participate in what amounted to a racist caricature of her own heritage. Each movement seemed to diminish her, strip away another piece of her dignity. Through the haze of their shock, they caught glimpses of Mrs. Dawson in the wings, nodding approvingly at each stereotypical gesture, each offensive movement. The teacher's satisfied smile made David's stomach turn. They had sent their daughter to school, expecting her to be educated and nurtured. Instead, they had unknowingly delivered her into the hands of people who saw nothing wrong with turning her heritage into a racist caricature for entertainment. The truth hit them like a physical blow. This hadn't been an accident or a misunderstanding. This had been deliberately planned and executed, with their daughter's dignity sacrificed for someone else's misguided notion of cultural celebration. The offensive music pounded through the auditorium speakers as Amara continued her forced performance, each movement a fresh wound to her dignity. In the audience, David Thompson's hands gripped the armrests of his seat, his knuckles white with tension. The sight of his daughter, his beautiful, confident child, being paraded around in that mockery of a costume, made something deep inside him snap. "No," he whispered, then louder, "No." Before Amina could react, David was on his feet. The sudden movement drew startled looks from nearby audience members, but he didn't care. His voice boomed through the auditorium, cutting through the inappropriate drum beats and synthetic tribal sounds. "Stop the music! Amara, stop!" The audience collectively gasped. On stage, Amara froze mid-movement, the ridiculous plastic beads of her costume rattling to a halt. The music continued for a few awkward seconds before someone finally cut it off, leaving the auditorium in stunned silence. David was already moving, striding purposefully down the aisle toward the stage. Principal Green stepped forward, her face a mask of confusion and disapproval. "Mr. Thompson, please return to your seat. We're in the middle of a performance dash." "A performance?" David's voice trembled with barely contained rage. "You call this racist mockery a performance?" Amina had caught up to him now, her own face streaked with tears of anger. On stage, Amara stood frozen, trembling visibly under the harsh stage lights. "Come down from there, baby," Amina called out, her voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to do this anymore." Mrs. Dawson emerged from the wings, her floral dress somehow more garish under the stage lights. "Now, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, there's no need for dramatics. This is a celebration of Dash." "Celebration?" David's voice cracked like a whip. "You call humiliating my daughter a celebration?" By now, murmurs had broken out across the auditorium. Some parents were starting to shift uncomfortably in their seats, as if seeing the performance through new eyes. Others looked confused, not understanding what the fuss was about. Amara finally moved, practically running off the stage toward her parents. David caught her in his arms, feeling her whole body shake with suppressed sobs. The offensive costume rustled against his suit, and he could smell the cheap face paint that had been smeared across her cheeks. "Let's take this discussion backstage," Principal Green suggested, clearly trying to maintain control of the situation. "There's no need to disrupt the entire show dash." "Oh, I think this needs to be disrupted," Amina said, her voice ice-cold. "I think everyone here needs to understand exactly what's been happening in this school." They moved backstage anyway, but not because of the principal's suggestion. David wanted to get Amara away from the prying eyes of the audience. The backstage area was dimly lit and cluttered with props and costume pieces, including several other offensive cultural costumes hanging on a rack. Mrs. Dawson followed them, her heels clicking against the floor with sharp, aggressive taps. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, I must say I'm disappointed in your reaction. This was meant to be a beautiful celebration of African culture dash." "African culture?" Amina whirled on her, eyes blazing. "Which African culture, Mrs. Dawson?" "Africa is a continent with thousands of distinct cultures and traditions. But you wouldn't know that, would you? Because this dash," she gestured at Amara's costume, "this isn't about celebrating anything. This is about mockery. I assure you, that was not my intention." Mrs. Dawson drew herself up, trying to maintain her authority. "I've been organizing these cultural appreciation performances for years dash." "Years?" David's voice was dangerously quiet. "You've been doing this to children for years?" Amara, still trembling in her father's arms, finally spoke. Her voice was small but clear in the tense atmosphere. She said, "I had to do it. She said if I didn't participate, it would show I wasn't a team player, that it would affect my grades." The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. Principal Green's face had gone pale, while Mrs. Dawson showed the first flicker of genuine concern. "That's not exactly what I said dash," Mrs. Dawson began, but Amara continued, as if a dam had broken inside her. "You said it would look bad on my permanent record if I refused. You said colleges look for students who participate in cultural events. You said," her voice caught on a sob, "you said I should be proud to represent my heritage, and if I refused, it meant I was ashamed of who I was." Amina made a sound like she'd been punched in the gut. David's arms tightened around his daughter protectively. "You threatened my child's academic future to force her into this racist spectacles?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried such weight that Mrs. Dawson took an involuntary step backward. The backstage door opened, and several other parents began to filter in, drawn by the commotion. Among them was Mrs. Chun, whose son had performed the caricatured Asian dance earlier in the show. "Is everything all right?" "We heard dash." Mrs. Chun stopped short, taking in the scene. Her eyes fixed on Amara's costume, then moved to her son's similar outfit hanging on the nearby rack. Something seemed to click in her expression. "They made your daughter do it too?" she asked quietly. The two hung in the air like a thunderclap. More parents were crowding in now. Mr. Rodriguez, whose son had worn the stereotypical Mexican costume. Mrs. Patel, whose daughter had been scheduled to perform a Bollywood number later in the show. Each face showed a growing recognition, a dawning horror, as they began to understand the full scope of what had been happening. "My son came home crying after rehearsals," Mrs. Chun said into the charged silence. "He said he didn't want to do it, but Mrs. Dawson told him it would affect his chances of getting into the advanced math program next year." "Isabella was the same," Mr. Rodriguez added. "She said Mrs. Dawson made her feel like she was letting down her entire culture if she didn't participate." Principal Green was looking increasingly alarmed as more parents spoke up, each story more damning than the last. Mrs. Dawson's professional demeanor was cracking, her perfectly maintained smile slipping at the edges. "Now, let's not blow this out of proportion," she attempted. "These performances have always been well received. We've won awards for our diversity programming dash." "Awards?" Amina's laugh was bitter. "You've won awards for forcing children to perform racist caricatures of their own cultures? For threatening their academic futures if they refuse? That's a very serious accusation," Principal Green interjected, finally seeming to grasp the gravity of the situation. "Mrs. Dawson, is this true? Have you been coercing students?" Mrs. Dawson's face flushed. "I merely encourage participation. These children need to learn to embrace their heritage dash." "Our heritage?" David's voice cut through her protests. "You think this dash," he gestured at the offensive costume his daughter still wore, "has anything to do with our heritage? This is nothing but harmful stereotypes and racist caricatures." More parents were speaking up now, their voices overlapping as years of silent concerns finally found expression. Stories of children coming home upset, of subtle threats about grades and opportunities, of uncomfortable performances justified under the banner of cultural celebration. In the midst of the growing chaos, Amina had pulled out her phone and was recording everything. Mrs. Dawson noticed and started to object, but Mr. Rodriguez cut her off. "Let her record," he said firmly. "We need evidence. This has gone on long enough." The word evidence seemed to hit Principal Green like a physical blow. "Now, let's not be hasty. I'm sure we can resolve this internally dash." "Internally?" David's voice was incredulous. "Like you've been handling it internally for years?" "No. This ends now, and it ends legally." A murmur of agreement ran through the gathered parents. Mrs. Patel stepped forward, her voice steady despite her evident anger. "My cousin is a civil rights attorney. She'll want to hear about this." The mention of legal action caused visible panic on both Mrs. Dawson's and Principal Green's faces. The principal tried to regain control of the situation. "Please, let's discuss this in my office dash." "Oh, we'll discuss it," Amina said, still recording. "We'll discuss it with lawyers present. We'll discuss it with the school board present. We'll discuss it with everyone who needs to understand exactly what's been happening in this school." The other parents were nodding, pulling out their own phones, taking pictures of the offensive costumes, sharing contact information with each other. What had started as one father's desperate attempt to protect his daughter had transformed into something larger, a community finally confronting years of normalized discrimination. Amara, still in her father's protective embrace, had stopped trembling. She watched with growing amazement as more parents arrived, as more stories emerged, as the adults around her transformed from passive observers into fierce advocates. Mrs. Chun had pulled out a business card. "My brother-in-law works for the local news station. They should hear about this too. The school board meets next Tuesday," Mr. Rodriguez added. "We should all be there." The energy in the backstage area had shifted completely. What had begun as a confrontation had evolved into something more powerful, the beginning of a movement. Parents were exchanging phone numbers, making plans, organizing themselves into a force for change. Mrs. Dawson, seeing her carefully maintained system crumbling around her, made one last attempt to regain control. "You're all overreacting. These performances are a beloved tradition dash. A tradition of racism is still racism." David cut her off. "And it ends today." Principal Green, finally reading the room correctly, tried to salvage what she could. "I assure you, the school takes these allegations very seriously. We'll conduct a thorough investigation dash." "You're right about one thing," Amina said, her phone still recording. "This will be thoroughly investigated. But not by you. Not anymore." The parents continued to organize, breaking into smaller groups, sharing stories and contact information. Someone started a group text chain. Another parent, a lawyer himself, began taking detailed notes of everyone's experiences. Through it all, Amara remained in her father's arms, watching as her small act of suffering catalyzed something much bigger than herself. The shame and fear that had haunted her for weeks began to fade, replaced by something new, a sense of vindication, of justice beginning to unfold. "Dad," she whispered, looking up at him with tears still streaking through the offensive face paint. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner." David hugged her tighter. "No, baby. We're sorry we didn't see it sooner. But it's over now, and we're going to make sure it never happens to anyone else." Amina joined them, wrapping her arms around both her husband and daughter. "We're going to fix this," she promised. "All of us, together." Around them, the community continued to mobilize. Parents exchanged stories, planned strategies, and promised support. What had started as one family's stand against injustice had grown into something much more powerful. A community united in its determination to protect its children and demand change. The talent show that was supposed to continue in the auditorium was forgotten. Instead, in that cramped backstage area, surrounded by the very costumes and props that had been used to humiliate their children, a different kind of performance was taking place. The performance of democracy in action, of community organizing, of parents saying enough to institutional racism disguised as cultural celebration. And at the center of it all stood Amara, still wearing the offensive costume, but somehow standing taller now, surrounded by adults who were finally seeing, finally understanding, finally acting. The trembling, frightened girl who had taken the stage was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who had helped spark a movement for change. As the parents continued to organize and plan, as phone numbers were exchanged and stories shared, as promises of legal action and media coverage filled the air, one thing became crystal clear. This was more than just a moment of protest. This was the beginning of a revolution in their community, a commitment to ensuring that no child would ever again be forced to demean their own culture for someone else's misguided notion of celebration. The talent show had ended, but something much more important had begun. The days following the talent show unfolded in a whirlwind of activity. The Thompsons' living room became an impromptu command center, with parents cycling through at all hours, sharing stories and building their case against the school. Laptops covered every surface as they documented years of inappropriate cultural celebrations that had gone unchallenged for far too long. "Look at this," Amina said one evening, turning her laptop to show David. Mrs. Chun found photos from last year's talent show. The costumes, the performances, it's the same pattern. "How do we never notice?" David leaned in, scrolling through images that made his stomach turn. "We trusted the school," he said quietly. "We all did. That's what makes this so much worse." In the kitchen, they could hear Amara talking with Mei Chun and Carlos Rodriguez, other students who had been forced to participate in Mrs. Dawson's performances. The children had formed their own support group of sorts, finding strength in sharing their experiences. "She told me I had to wear the dragon costume," Mei was saying. "When I said Chinese New Year celebrations don't actually have people dressed as dragons, she said I wasn't being authentic enough." "Yeah," Carlos added. "And when I tried to explain that not all Mexican music involves maracas and sombreros, she said I was being difficult and threatened to drop me from the advanced Spanish class." The sound of their children's voices, thick with remembered pain but growing stronger in solidarity, fueled the parents' determination. Mr. Rodriguez, who worked in digital marketing, had created a secure online portal where families could submit their testimonies and evidence. Mrs. Chin's brother-in-law at the local news station had begun preliminary interviews. One afternoon, as Amina was organizing the growing collection of evidence, she found Amara sitting alone in her room, staring at her reflection in the mirror. "Sweetheart?" Amina sat beside her daughter. "What's on your mind?" Amara touched her cheek where the offensive face paint had been. Though long washed away, the memory of it seemed to linger. What if people at school make fun of me? What if they show those pictures everywhere?" Amina pulled her daughter close. "Listen to me, Amara. You did nothing wrong. Nothing. Mrs. Dawson and the school. They're the ones who should be ashamed, not you." "But I should have said no," Amara whispered. I should have been stronger. You were strong, David said from the doorway, where he'd been listening. You were so strong, honey. It takes incredible strength to stand up to authority, especially when you're young. And when you told the truth about what happened, you helped other students find their voice too. Slowly, day by day, Amara began to heal. The support group she'd formed with the other students grew, meeting regularly at different houses to share stories and support each other. They started calling themselves the Culture Club, reclaiming their heritage on their own terms. The media attention exploded faster than anyone anticipated. What began as a local news story quickly caught fire on social media. National news outlets picked up the story, running headlines like "Cultural Celebration or Racial Mockery," and "School's Diversity Program Exposed as Systematic Discrimination." The Thompsons' phone rang constantly with interview requests. David and Amina carefully screened each one, protective of their daughter and the other children involved. They agreed to a few carefully selected interviews where they could control the narrative and protect the students' dignity. The public reaction was immediate and fierce. Social media exploded with outrage as more details emerged. Former students from years past began coming forward with their own stories, revealing a pattern that stretched back through Mrs. Dawson's entire teaching career. This isn't just about one talent show, David explained during a particularly powerful television interview. This is about years of systematic exploitation of minority students, all under the guise of celebrating diversity. Our children were coerced into performing racist caricatures of their own cultures, threatened with academic consequences if they refused. The school board couldn't ignore the mounting pressure. They called an emergency meeting where parents and students were invited to testify. The auditorium was packed, with news cameras lining the walls and overflow crowds watching on monitors in the hallway. Amara sat between her parents, listening as family after family shared their stories. When it was her turn to speak, she squeezed her mother's hand and walked to the podium. Though her voice shook at first, it grew stronger as she spoke. Mrs. Dawson said she was helping us celebrate our culture, she told the silent room. But she wasn't celebrating anything. She was making fun of us, making us act out stereotypes that hurt us and our families. She said we had to do it to prove we weren't ashamed of who we are. But she's the one who should be ashamed. Her words rang through the auditorium, followed by a moment of complete silence before the room erupted in supportive applause. Several school board members were visibly moved, wiping away tears. The investigation moved swiftly after that. Internal emails revealed that both Mrs. Dawson and Principal Green had ignored previous complaints from parents and students. The school's celebrated diversity program was exposed as a shallow exercise in stereotyping, winning awards from organizations that never bothered to question its methods or impact on students. Mrs. Dawson was placed on administrative leave pending termination. Principal Green, facing mounting pressure and criticism, submitted her resignation. But for the families involved, this was just the beginning. Real change has to come from within the community, Amina argued at a parent meeting. We need to be involved in creating new policies, new programs that actually celebrate our cultures authentically. The school board agreed. They established a diversity advisory council with representatives from various cultural communities. Students were invited to participate, sharing their perspectives on what genuine cultural celebration should look like. One evening, about a month after the talent show, Amara was helping her mother prepare dinner when she suddenly stopped chopping vegetables. "Mom," she said thoughtfully, "I think I want to do another performance." Amina froze, concerned. "Honey, you don't have to dash." "No, I mean a real one," Amara explained. "The Culture Club, we've been talking. We want to put on our own show, showing our cultures the right way. The way our families actually celebrate them." The idea took root and blossomed. The students worked with their families and community members to create authentic presentations of their cultural heritage. They researched traditional music, learned proper cultural dances, and designed accurate costumes. The new performance was scheduled for the following month. This time, when Amara took the stage, she wore a beautiful dress that her grandmother had helped select, representing their actual cultural traditions. She performed a dance she had learned from her aunt, who had studied traditional African dance for years. The audience watched in respectful silence as each student shared a genuine piece of their heritage. There were no stereotypes, no caricatures, just proud young people sharing their authentic cultures with their community. After the show, as families mingled in the auditorium, David overheard two school board members talking. "This is what cultural celebration should look like," one said. "This is what we should have been doing all along." Later that night, as the Thompsons drove home, Amara spoke up from the back seat. "You know what? I'm not embarrassed anymore about what happened to the talent show. No." Amina turned to look at her daughter. "No," Amara said firmly, "because we changed things. We made it better, not just for us, but for everyone who comes after us." David caught his daughter's eye in the rearview mirror. "We're so proud of you, sweetheart. Of all of you kids. You turned something horrible into something beautiful." The next day at school, Amara noticed something different. Students who had previously avoided eye contact now smiled at her in the hallways. Several teachers made a point of telling her how brave she had been. Even some of the students who had laughed during the talent show approached her to apologize. The Culture Club continued to meet, evolving into a student-led organization dedicated to genuine cultural exchange and education. They organized workshops where students could share their traditions, foods, and stories in their own words, on their own terms. Mrs. Chin's son started a blog documenting their journey, which quickly gained followers nationwide. Other schools began reaching out, asking for advice on creating authentic cultural programs. The story of their small community's transformation was becoming a model for others to follow. One afternoon, as Amara worked on homework at the kitchen table, she found herself humming the traditional song she had performed in the new show. Amina watched her daughter, noting how she sat taller now, more confident in herself and her heritage. "Mom," Amara looked up from her books. "Do you think things will really be different now?" Amina sat down beside her daughter. "I think they already are, sweetheart. And not just here. What happened with Mrs. Dawson? It made people everywhere stop and think about how they celebrate other cultures. Sometimes it takes something painful to create real change. Like a vaccination," Amara said thoughtfully. "It hurts at first, but it makes things better in the end." David, who had been listening from the doorway, smiled at his daughter's analogy. "Exactly like that. And you know what? Years from now, when people talk about how things changed, they'll remember it started with a brave group of kids who stood up and said enough." The phone rang, another reporter requesting an interview. But this time, instead of asking about the scandal, they wanted to know about the positive changes happening in the community. They wanted to hear about the new programs, the student initiatives, the way a painful incident had transformed into a movement for genuine understanding and respect. As Amina talked to the reporter, Amara returned to her homework, but now she was smiling. On her notebook, she had drawn a small logo for the Culture Club, a circle of holding hands, each one different, all connected. Below it, she had written their new motto: "Our cultures, our voices, our truth." The talent show that had caused so much pain was now a distant memory, replaced by something far more meaningful. A community that had learned to truly see, hear, and celebrate each other, not through stereotypes and caricatures, but through authentic voices and shared understanding. And at the heart of it all was a group of brave students who had turned their pain into power, their embarrassment into strength, and their silence into a chorus of voices that could no longer be ignored. They had learned perhaps the most important lesson of all, that true celebration of culture begins with respect, understanding, and the courage to stand up for what's right. As summer approached, the wounds from the talent show incident began to heal. Amara sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, surrounded by art supplies, her curls pulled back in a neat ponytail. She was working on a series of portraits, faces of different cultures, each one unique and beautiful in its own way. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Amina said from the doorway, admiring the careful brushstrokes her daughter was applying to her latest piece. "Is this for the cultural art exhibition?" Amara nodded, adding another delicate line to the portrait. "Ms. Rodriguez, you know Carlos's mom? She's been teaching me traditional art techniques. She says art can tell stories that words sometimes can't." The art classes had been Amara's idea. After the talent show incident, she discovered that creating art helped her process her feelings. What started as simple sketches in her journal had evolved into a serious interest in multicultural art forms. Now, twice a week, different parents from their community volunteered to teach traditional art techniques from their cultures. Mom, Amara set down her brush, looking thoughtful. Remember when I used to be scared to talk about our culture at school? Amina sat down beside her daughter, careful not to disturb the art supplies. I remember, honey. I'm not scared anymore, Amara said firmly. Actually, I'm proud. Like really proud. Not the fake kind of proud Mrs. Dawson wanted us to be. The mention of Mrs. Dawson no longer brought that shadow of fear to Amara's eyes. The former teacher had been officially terminated after a thorough investigation, and the school board's formal apology had helped provide closure for many of the affected students. The changes at Riverside Elementary were profound and ongoing. The new principal, Dr. Martinez, had been carefully selected for her track record of promoting genuine cultural understanding. She'd immediately established a parent-teacher cultural advisory committee, with Amina and David serving as founding members. The key, Dr. Martinez had explained during her first committee meeting, is to move beyond superficial celebrations to real understanding. We need to create an environment where every student's cultural identity is respected, not performed. The committee's first major project was developing new guidelines for cultural education and celebration. Gone were the costume parades and stereotype-laden performances. In their place, the school introduced thoughtfully designed programs that emphasized authentic cultural exchange. One afternoon, as David picked Amara up from school, he noticed she was practically bouncing with excitement. "Dad, guess what?" she called out, running to meet him. "I got picked to help design the new Cultural Heritage Center in the library." The Heritage Center had been one of the reforms mandated by the lawsuit settlement. The school district had not only provided monetary compensation to the affected families, but had also committed substantial resources to creating permanent changes in how cultural diversity was approached. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," David smiled, remembering how different this excitement was from the forced enthusiasm of the talent show preparations. "What are your ideas?" "We're going to have real artifacts that families can share, and stories written by students about their cultures, and a special section for art." Amara continued chattering happily as they drove home, her hands moving animatedly as she described her plans. The lawsuit's success had created ripples beyond their own school district. Amina and David found themselves increasingly called upon to speak at educational conferences and parent advocacy meetings. Their story had become a catalyst for change in schools across the state. "It's not just about preventing another talent show disaster," Amina explained during one such conference. "It's about creating an environment where every child feels truly seen and valued for who they are, not what others think they should be." Their advocacy work had brought unexpected allies. Mrs. Chun had started a parent network that helped families navigate cultural issues in schools. Mr. Rodriguez used his marketing expertise to create resources for parents who needed to address similar concerns in their own communities. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, Amara made an announcement. "I've decided what I want to be when I grow up," she declared, serving herself an extra helping of her grandmother's special rice dish, a recipe she had recently learned as part of her cultural exploration. "Oh!" David exchanged an amused glance with Amina. Their daughter's career aspirations tended to change weekly. "I want to be an art therapist," Amara said firmly. "Like helping kids use art to talk about hard things." "Ms. Rodriguez says that's a real job." "It absolutely is," Amina confirmed, touched by her daughter's choice. "And I think you'd be wonderful at it." The following week brought another milestone. Amara's art series, Faces of Our Community, was selected to be displayed at the district's educational center. The opening reception drew educators from across the state, eager to see how one school's crisis had transformed into an opportunity for genuine cultural celebration. Watching their daughter confidently explain her artwork to visitors, David wrapped an arm around Amina's shoulders. "Remember how worried we were about her? Look at her now." Indeed, the change in Amara was remarkable. Gone was the frightened girl who had trembled backstage in an offensive costume. In her place stood a confident young person who had found her voice and was using it to help others find theirs. The exhibition's success led to an unexpected opportunity. A prestigious summer arts program had heard about Amara's story and offered her a scholarship. The program emphasized multicultural arts and social justice, perfect for a young artist finding her voice. "Are you sure you want to go?" Amina asked when the offer came. "It's 6 weeks away from home." Amara nodded decisively. "I'm sure. And you know what? I want to teach some of the other kids what I learned, not just about art, but about standing up for what's right." The support from their community continued to grow. Local businesses had started sponsoring cultural education programs. The public library established a special collection of authentic cultural resources, with input from community members. Even the local theater company had reached out, offering to collaborate on performances that would properly celebrate the community's diverse heritage. 1 year after the talent show incident, Riverside Elementary held a very different kind of celebration. The Cultural Heritage Festival, organized by the Student Parent Committee, featured authentic performances, art exhibitions, and storytelling sessions. Each presentation was developed in consultation with community members, ensuring respect and accuracy. Amara participated by leading an art workshop, teaching other students the techniques she had learned over the past year. Watching her daughter guide her peers with confidence and compassion, Amina felt tears welling up in her eyes. "She's amazing," Mrs. Chun said, joining her. "They all are. Who would have thought that something so painful could lead to this?" The festival became an annual event, but its impact extended far beyond a single day of celebration. The school's approach to cultural education had been fundamentally transformed. Teachers underwent regular cultural sensitivity training, and the curriculum was continuously reviewed to ensure it promoted understanding rather than stereotypes. The lawsuit settlement had included a requirement for annual audits of the school's cultural programs. But what started as a mandatory obligation had evolved into a model of educational reform. Other districts regularly sent observers to learn from Riverside's example. One afternoon, as Amara prepared for her first day of middle school, she paused while packing her new art supplies. "Mom? Dad? Can I tell you something?" "Of course, sweetheart," David said, looking up from where he was checking her supply list. "I'm kind of glad it happened," Amara said quietly. "Not the bad parts, but if we hadn't stood up to Mrs. Dawson, maybe things wouldn't have changed. Maybe other kids would still be feeling scared and wrong about who they are." Amina pulled her daughter into a hug. "You helped make that change happen, honey. You were so brave. And you showed other people how to be brave, too." The changes weren't limited to their school. The Thompson family had become known as advocates for cultural respect in education. They received letters from parents and students across the country, sharing similar stories and asking for advice. "It's like ripples in a pond," David often said. "One small stone can create waves that reach far beyond where it fell." The family established a small foundation, using part of the settlement money to help other communities implement cultural education programs that celebrated diversity without resorting to stereotypes. They named it the Ripple Effect Foundation, inspired by David's metaphor. As Amara started middle school, she carried with her not just the usual school supplies, but also the confidence that came from knowing who she was and what she stood for. Her art portfolio included pieces that told stories of struggle and triumph, of identity and pride, of a community coming together to fight for what was right. The new school year brought fresh opportunities. Amara joined the Student Council, where she helped organize cultural exchange programs that emphasized authentic voices and experiences. She continued her art therapy training, working with younger students who needed help expressing their own stories. One evening, as the family sat in their backyard enjoying the late summer breeze, Amara showed them her latest artwork, a mural design for the school's entrance hall. "See, each panel represents a different culture," she explained, pointing to the detailed sketches. "But they're all connected, showing how we're different but part of the same community. And look, I left empty spaces here and here, so new students can add their own stories." David and Amina exchanged proud glances. Their daughter had taken a painful experience and transformed it into something beautiful and healing. The mural would serve as both art and reminder, a testament to how far they'd come and a promise to keep moving forward. "You know what the best part is?" Amara continued, her eyes shining with excitement. The school board wants to use this design as a template for other schools in the district. They say it represents everything we've been working for. As the sun set, casting warm colors across Amara's artwork, the family sat together, remembering how far they'd come from that terrible day at the talent show. The pain hadn't been forgotten, but it had been transformed into purpose, into action, into change. "I have one more surprise," Amara said, pulling out another sketch. "I'm calling it The Journey. It shows where we started and where we are now. See? The dark parts gradually become brighter, but they're still part of the picture, because we shouldn't forget. We should remember and keep making things better." Looking at her daughter's artwork, Amina saw more than just colors and shapes. She saw the story of their family's fight for justice, their community's journey toward understanding, and most importantly, her daughter's transformation from victim to advocate. The talent show that had caused so much pain had become a catalyst for positive change, not just in their school but in their entire community. And at the center of it all was Amara, no longer the frightened girl forced to perform stereotypes, but a confident young artist using her voice and her talents to help build a better, more understanding world. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the sky, the Thompson family sat together, sharing stories and dreams for the future. They had fought for change and won, but they knew their work wasn't finished. There would always be more stories to tell, more voices to amplify, more bridges to build. But now they had the tools, the support, and most importantly, the courage to continue the journey. And as Amara showed them one final sketch, a self-portrait filled with confidence and hope, they knew that their fight had been worth every moment. The future stretched out before them, bright with possibility, rich with authentic celebration of culture and identity. And in that future, their story would continue to inspire others to stand up, speak out, and fight for what's right, one ripple at a time. Amara's story is a powerful reminder that true resilience isn't just about enduring life's humiliations, but about finding the strength to reclaim your joy and dignity, no matter the cost. How would you have felt if you were in Amara's shoes, stepping onto the stage for a performance that turned into a nightmare? Have you ever faced a moment where you had to stand up for yourself, even when it felt like no one was listening? Let us know in the comments below. And if Amara's journey touched your heart, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss more inspiring and emotional stories like this one.